Tabletops will start after the following messages.
Are you looking for something comfortable to wear and keep your brain warm while playing tabletop games? Daily Dose of Yarn makes handmade, customized beanies for all of your style and comfort needs. She can even help you with a custom beanie to represent your favorite character. Check out Daily Dose of Yarn on Instagram and Etsy to order your new favorite beanie today.
The world is electric with psychic energy, an interconnected web of memory and emotional echoes that only animals are able to perceive. Nowhere is that energy more powerfully present than in human trash. Psychic Trash Detectives is the first release from Scripted Games. In this collaborative tabletop role-playing game, players create their own psychic trash animals like raccoons and possums. They mine trash for psychic clues to solve a mystery plaguing their animal community. It is a game that absolutely reeks of radical self-acceptance and punk camaraderie. You can pledge Psychic Trash Detectives now on Kickstarter. Live fast, touch trash, solve mysteries.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode from the Vault. This is Nick, your host, and your dog that ran away. But I'm back now, woof woof. And this is the fourth day in a row that we have dropped an episode in your feed because we are celebrating 1 year of Tabletop. And this is a very fun episode. I like this one a lot. It is my interview with Natalie Mesnard, or Nat Mesnard. They are so cool. They are a teacher of interactive fiction writing, and in the time between when we have interviewed them and now, they have actually got a group together and made an independent publisher for games. So you're going to see a lot more of their stuff in your feed from us. We have a developer coming on soon to talk about Psychic Trash Detectives, which is going to be very cool. And of course, we're going to have Nat and all of the crew from Scripted Games, their new publisher, to come on and tell you a little bit about them. But that's enough for me. Let's get to this interview with Nat Mesnard. Welcome back, everybody, to Tabletops. Today I have a fantastic guest on the pod. Nat Mesnard is on the faculty at the Pratt Institute and the School of Visual Arts and co-host of the podcast Queers at the End of the World. Nat has published poetry, fiction, writes for indie RPGs all over the place. They are also an indie dev for TTRPGs like Business Wizards, and also Horseshoe Academy and games in all 3 years of the Level 1 anthology. Feel free to look at the show notes. We're going to have links to all these great games. Nat, is so great to have you on Tabletop. How are you?
Good. It's so great to be here. Thank you for that introduction.
Yeah, of course. It's definitely, you've earned all of it. It's a very impressive biography. I've been so excited to talk to you. When you reached out, you said that you really wanted to talk about the development of indie titles, and that is sort of like right in our wheelhouse. Can you tell me a little bit, just to start out, you teach on this subject quite a bit. Can you tell me and our audience a little bit of the difference between writing interactive fiction versus writing normal fiction or nonfiction or any other sort of writing projects?
Sure, yeah. So, interactive fiction is what I love, and traditional fiction is what I'm trained in.
Yeah.
I'm one of those, people that comes to game development with a background in both creative writing and math.
Yeah.
And that is, the perfect combination of things for landing in interactive fiction. Mm. So, thinking about traditional fiction, obviously a novel or a short story, you sit down to read it. It's this set of words on a page that casts a spell on you, and your mind creates this really cool picture, right? That's the experience. That's what you're trying to do when you write fiction. But then in interactive fiction, we're thinking anything from a choose-your-own-adventure novel, a game made in Twine, so maybe like a text thing where you can click choices.
Right.
Do you go through door 1 or door 2, right?
Exactly.
And RPGs are also interactive fiction. So the idea there is the audience has agency, choice, control over how the story proceeds in some kind of way.
Yeah.
That can be binary choices. That can be, we get the material for the story and make it right now, which is what an RPG is. There's all kinds of different ways people get at this idea of like letting readers come in and participate in the story. And that is what I consider interactive fiction.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I'm just like burbling with a ton of questions. Like one of the big things that I'm like super obsessed with when I either run games or I'm writing out games or I'm trying to create some sort of fiction on my end is the power of the narrator's voice. And I think that a lot of that, even if you're doing, you know, a text-based binary adventure, the narrator's voice is giving you specific options. It is pulling your attention towards these things, and it is progressing a story in a very purposeful way. And it always seems like the narrator's voice is so hard to kind of wrangle, to keep the participants in whatever game you're playing to feel very open and free to do what and express themselves and put themselves into the game the way they want to do. When you're in the development side, how do you account for like the narrator's voice and the limitations that brings, but also the focus and the drive that brings for the story, the tempo of the story? That was a little bit of a rambling question, but I hope that got through.
It does. I think about those issues a lot. I mean, thinking about like a narrator, right? So in traditional fiction, we might talk about, okay, what POV are you going to write this in? And we have omniscient narrators, right? Like this godlike being that kind of see, right? And you can almost imagine like some stories are like, and some video game stories even kind of look like this. Like there's this hovering camera and there's these little people down there. And like to your point, that can be removing of agency because there feels like there's this authority who knows what the story is.
Right.
So, but also the narrator is the vehicle through which we understand like, what is the feel of this story? You know, how do we play within it? So, of course, like in a tabletop context, the GM is doing that. But the GM doesn't want to be the only storyteller.
Yeah.
So there's so many fun ways to play with this. One of the things I do when I'm teaching interactive fiction is we sit down and we do a bunch of writing in the second person.
Okay.
So we start to talk about this idea of you.
Right.
And what it means to like narrate a story by saying everything through the lens of you do this, you do that. There's a lot of aesthetic implications when you write in the second person. And interestingly, if you study traditional creative writing, there's sometimes like these certain rules they'll give you, like don't have the character wake up at the end, it was all a dream is one of them. And another one is don't write in the second person.
Yeah.
So actually, I really love doing that because I'm like, let's break the rules a little bit and start out with this sense when you're making up a story that from the beginning, you're relating with the person that's reading it.
Yeah.
And thinking about, so there's ways that you can write in the second person that feel combative.
Yeah.
Where you're like, as the reader, you're like, you know, if it says something like, you have blonde hair, you're like, okay, so that's not me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But then, like, when we get into some of the ways people have used the second person throughout the history of interactive fiction, it can become very immediate and sensory. You feel a wind blowing on your face. And then, like, the narrator is becoming someone who is this kind of vehicle of delivering setting, sensory details.
Yeah. Through
the acknowledgement that the audience and the writer are in this relationship.
Yeah, I love what you said about that it can be combative if you do not account for the person who's consuming the fiction. I think that is so true. I just really love that it's sort of like a do not in creative writing, sort of like, you know, classes and things, just because there's such in the Western canon, especially now with the rise of video games and the desire, I think, for a lot of people to express agency within their fiction. That it's really the only way to do that. Like, even if you look at like old school RPGs, it's like, hey, whatever your name is, what's your name? I forgot. And then it's like, yeah, you should go over there and do this and that kind of thing. And all the way until now, like, our audience knows that I harp on this all the time, but the Apocalypse system, the Apocalypse World, Monster of the Week, Urban Shadows, all those really great TTRPGs, they actually say explicitly that after you're done narrating anything, that you, instead of creating a firm boundary that, like you said, might be a little bit more combative, you say, what do you do? Mm-hmm. And so you are actually just creating the picture in which for people to kind of puppet themselves around in with their avatars. And I think that's just like really, really interesting to me. So when you're sitting down to start writing one of these pieces of interactive fiction, you probably have a germ of an idea in your head about what you're trying to express. How do you start translating that out into sort of a story map or a plot arc or things that accounts for a player or another entity that will interact with it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It definitely depends on, of course, the tools and where you want this to end up.
Yeah.
It's the cool thing is, like, if you're writing in Twine, which is, if folks listening are not familiar with Twine, it's this amazing tool for writing interactive fiction. You sit down and within minutes you can learn to create a nonlinear map that kind of is built on hyperlinks that let you create branching and choice.
Is Twine software? Because actually I haven't heard of this either.
Yeah.
So is this a software, or is it just sort of a methodology of writing, or?
Yeah. It's actually software. So you can check it out. Twinery.org is the website for this. Mm-hmm. What you face when you sit down to build something in Twine is this infinite kind of pasteboard. And you start putting these little squares on it.
Yeah.
And all of the squares are connected to each other by these arrows that delineate the hyperlinks that you've created in each of these passages.
Yeah.
And with that, you start to think about, okay, how do I structure this out? And I would also actually say that I think RPGs are similar in that way. You're sitting down and you're like, okay, I have this idea. I need to give people some kind of structure within the idea. Mm-hmm. Because structure is what lets people in.
Yeah.
And that may sound counterintuitive, right? Because it's like, we want to let people improvise. We want to give people choices. Why would it make sense for there to be like, okay, so we're going to put all these like tiny little boxes in here?
Yeah.
But actually, like, the thing I always say in any realm of interactive fiction is constraints lead to creativity.
Yeah. I have a lot of very deep held feelings about this. I think that I agree with you 100%. I think creativity is not allowing people to do absolutely anything. It is the creativity of making people feel like they have a huge amount of agency within a walled garden sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah. It's true. I really love that duality. Like, because if you sit someone down, I used to do a lot of board game design, and there was this one game that some friends had designed where it was like the creative constraints were a little bit off.
Yeah.
And I remember it because the idea was that you had to come up with like a pitch for an idea for a company. Mm-hmm. And you would draw these two cards, right? And then you had to like make those into a pitch.
Yeah.
And people, it was like not constrained enough. So people would sit there and say, I have no idea.
Yeah.
And there's like that moment of paradox of choice, right? Mm-hmm. Like if there's too many options, we actually can't think of anything. So I feel like go ahead.
I'm so sorry for interrupting.
No,
I'm just like latching onto this because I think that there's sort of discourse happening right now within, I think, the games community and just like all games, but I've been hearing it mostly from the tabletop side of people saying like, I hate being on rails. I don't want to be on rails. I want to be my own sort of advocate within this game and be able to make the choices that I want to make. Yeah. And I actually think that is wrong. I think that people don't actually want that because every single game I've ever been in, when there's just like, okay, the doors open, you see a beautiful world in front of you. What do you guys want to do in it? Then people are like, I don't know. What do you think we should do in it?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think that there, and I know that people have really negative feelings towards games like Mass Effect, especially towards the end, where there was this sort of binary or like 3 choices that all kind of did the same thing. But I was talking about this with my friend recently, and if you think of it as a full product, all 3 games as one product, they did an incredible job of making people feel like they had the agency to do whatever they wanted and express themselves through these kind of avatars within the game for like 2.5 games. Where they were like, but it was all on rails. I mean, there was like no way that you could ever do something that they didn't want you to, that they hadn't programmed in. And then by the end, they're like, wait, I made all these choices. These don't like make sense to me. But that was kind of the story that they were always telling. So it's interesting. I think that when you get to the, and I also have a lot of complicated feelings about how to end things, but as long as you make the choices feel like they amount to something that is unique to them, I feel like that you can always succeed, even if you have people on rails for most of the experience. What do you think about that, especially like leading up to some sort of like conclusion? Is there like a mechanical way to make people feel like within the writing to make people feel like, this is something that I have created at the end? Or is it more like don't look at the man behind the curtain sort of thing?
Man, that's a really good question. I have been thinking about this a lot myself because I actually just recently got to play this incredible video game called Norco.
Okay.
Unbelievable piece of interactive fiction. And I was just like, it honestly renewed my faith in the power of interactive fiction and video games.
Yeah.
And people, I obviously I always get on and read to see what people are talking about with interactive fiction. And people were like, oh, the ending sucked.
Yeah.
You know, it was irritating. And they ran out of time is such like a classic like critique of the way people bring things to an end.
Yeah.
I think it's hard because when you get people kind of out in the branches, people out in the possibilities, kind of you get this phenomenon where everyone kind of becomes a game designer.
Yeah,
you know,
or a writer at the very least.
Exactly, right? They're like, I'm part of this now, so like I have this idea for the way it was supposed to end, and I remembered that there was a writer at the end because, you know, speaking about structure, everything goes out into all of these branches, and then it all kind of has to come back somewhere.
Yeah.
So when you come to an ending, you narrow, like you're in the walled garden, and then it's like there's one door to exit the walls.
Yeah.
Or choose from these 3 doors, right?
Right.
And if we didn't do that, it's like we're going to end up writing millions of words to create all of these endings, and then it's exponential in how you would design for all of those endings to be possible.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know that there's a single solution to this. I have really been interested lately in games. Norco was a game like that. And I mean, even like really open-ended games like Dream Askew, Avery Alder's game of Queer Apocalypse, which I really love.
Yeah.
In a game like that, in both of those games, Norco is actually set in like New Orleans area. So it's a very specific area of the American South. You aren't just anybody. You're actually playing in a very sandboxy and open way of a very specific kind of story.
Yeah.
And I think that if you give people specificity in knowing the kind of story and the kind of character they're playing, and then let them branch out into, within that I get to make choices and create all these possibilities, when we do inevitably come back to the ending, we can reconcile the like removal of agency with the recognition that we weren't telling any story. We were telling this particular feel, this particular setting, this particular kind of narrative was what we sat down to play.
Yeah, that's so smart. I think that and you can kind of see, especially in the video game space, there's like especially for games that maybe have a little bit of a looser, maybe not quite as well written story, that they tend to use faceless avatars. So like in Halo, you have like Master Chief that has the helmet on all the time, or maybe you have something like in Half-Life where you really never see the face of the person that you are playing. And that is sort of like a development way of trying to get somebody to fill this blank slate with themselves.
Right.
I think that you are so right that I wonder if it's a Western like phenomenon where people are just bringing themselves even into stories that aren't theirs. So like when you're writing a story like you were talking about where it's set in a very specific place, it's a very specific experience that people are living through, that maybe some of that feeling of pushback towards like endings and just story structures in general is because we're so used to being catered to us as individuals, and like it's sort of like, hey, that's not what I would do, or that's not how I would feel in this situation. It's like, well, it's not you, it's this person that's like, you know what I mean? So
yes. Yeah. And I also wanted to loop back to something you said before about people saying like, I don't want to have rails.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, and I can see both sides of the coin.
Yeah.
One thing I will say about rails, though, is like, if you're given a sandbox, we have internal rails that we bring to open creative situations.
Say more about that, because we just talked about sandboxes, and like we didn't ever even think about that. So can you please like talk a little bit more about internal rails and like what that means to you and like what you think it does for us?
Yeah. One thing that we often talk about with this, just in any fiction writing situation, is especially for people who read and write in English and are part of the kind of Western world tradition of literature and writing, have an internal model of what a story is. Yeah. And that's constantly reinforced by popular media. It's this idea of rising action, conflict, crisis, and resolution. Yeah. And we use that structure to recognize that something is a story. Mm-hmm. That underlying understanding is part of what we all use to structure our behavior and the choices we make when we collaboratively write a role-playing game, right? Like, and by writing, I mean, as players, we're writing a story at this moment, right? Not like writing the text that leads to that, which is also a thing. But especially like if you think about like shared GM or GM-less games, those games have the text of the game, but then the internal rails of how to work on a story together. And speaking back to Dream Askew, which I got to play relatively recently with some folks, when we were getting to our end of our time box, because that game is really open-ended and you could play it for 10 hours. Yeah. We were all like, okay, it's time for the big climax. Yeah. And we all knew that because we all understand like how stories function. Right. And so the idea that there would be like true openness is really actually people wanting the constraints and the rails to come from a different source, I think.
That's so interesting. I think that, that resonates with me in a really strong way, because I as a player in a lot of games, I can feel like, and the way I sort of was thinking about it internally was tempo, of sort of like, this tempo feels wrong. Like something's not happening right now. Like we either need to speed this up, or like that happened really fast. We should really have like went through that moment a little bit more intricately. And I think it is exactly what you're saying, that we have such a strong sense of story structure built into us from a young age, that it feels like, okay, we know what to expect. We know when to expect it. And actually having a true sandbox where you're just kind of running around doing whatever, it is actually not going to allow for that same story structure to happen, because it isn't planned out that way. I think that I never had thought about it that way. How do you think about that with like one of your game, Business Wizards, which I did a read through, and I'm like, man, I can't wait to play this game. It's a little bit different in that it's more of like a genre experience rather than like a narrative arc, I guess. It's definitely like a game you play with friends. Can you talk a little bit the difference between those two things. One is like designing interactive fiction that is supposed to lead you through one of those story arcs, and designing interactive fiction that is supposed to be an experience that you have. Maybe it's just like a great night where you're laughing around, but it's not, 20 hours like in a row going through some sort of planned out story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, a lot of
also, sorry for interrupting. Can you tell us a little bit about Business Wizards as well? Because I every single person should look up Business Wizards. It's a very good idea.
Yes. Yeah. So Business Wizards, it's a high concept role-playing game of corporate horror set in the arcane world of business.
Yes.
So it's designed for one-shot play, and the idea is you are wizards with crummy corporate jobs. So it's kind of like Lord of the Rings crossed with The Office, Silicon Valley crossed with The Forgotten Realms, like whatever kind of mashup you want to imagine. So it's definitely, it's not like this like vast unfolding story. A lot of the work we do with Ninth Level Games, my co-designer and I wrote Business Wizards, Patrick Watson is the other writer on that game, is this sort of like wacky one-shot style of like, let's set a genre or like an experience, like a gameplay feel or a tone that we all want to explore together for like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
Right. So Business Wizards, the way we like structure the story is everyone sits down at the beginning and does a SWOT analysis, which is like so meta. SWOT analysis for those who are not suffering
blissfully unaware. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so you do this grid, right? And you do strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And they kind of like intersect in this grid. It's actually like, if you like RPGs, it's this moment where you're like, oh my God, like that's exactly the kind of thing I like in games, but it's horrifying in the context of work.
Yeah, of like just make the cold, hard reality of someone trying to extract as much capital out of all of us.
Exactly. So that becomes actually like this mechanism by which then you put these things down, and then you filled out this corporate chart, and then those become the prompts for the different scenes you play out.
It's so fantastic. Yeah, one of our co-hosts, Franco, he was reading through it with me, and he was just like, "Are you kidding? You start with a SWOT analysis? I gotta play this game right now." So it's a very strong start.
Yeah, it's very intense. We've had some people who are like, I refuse to play that. It's too dark.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, it's definitely like, there's this type of storytelling that I personally like that, like all theory aside, like one of my particular things I enjoy is like kind of messing with people's, it's a little bit like, let's violate the boundary of the magic circle a little bit. Magic circle, of course, being, I don't know if you guys have touched on that in this podcast before, but
we haven't. So please tell us more.
Yeah, it's this idea that like, when you sit down to play a game, you're delineating this space where certain rules apply. Yeah, and it's this kind of idea around like what creates a state of play, right? Yeah. So Magic Circle could be like a basketball court, right? On the basketball court, these are the rules. Outside, we don't have those rules. Yeah. RPGs, we create the Magic Circle through being like things like, okay, every time you finish talking, you say, what do you do? Right? Yeah. That's a rule that we set to create this experience of play where we all agree on these like different norms of how we're talking. Yeah. But in Business Wizards and some of the other games I've worked on, I kind of like to mess with that idea and kind of be like, okay, I'm destabilizing my sense of the binary between real life and play. Yeah. So like if you were, my dream scenario with that game is someone plays it and then they go sit in one of their like soul sucking corporate meetings and they're like giggling because they're like, oh, these people are a lot like wizards or whatever, you know, like.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that you do it very well because you do not break the circle in a way that is like, I cannot invest into this. Mm-hmm. You break it in a way of like, you peel back you peel back the ridiculousness of everyday life so that we are realizing that we're all kind of playing a game every day, and we're like, oh no.
Yes.
Yeah, like when we're at our corporate environments or whatever, and we're like, oh, haha, business wizards, and then you're like, oh no, but I'm doing this. This is like the thing I do.
Yes. Yep.
It's very smart. So when you go about creating like an environment like that where you are doing the experience versus telling a story, do you still sit down with the twine and try to like split out all of the possibilities, or do you instead say like, this is a feeling I am trying to achieve, and this is like, let's work towards that feeling, and then just sort of like write and prune depending on how what you develop, like how it affects the experience, I guess?
Yeah. So for an RPG like Business Wizards, and generally like RPG writing, it comes back to the narrative voice that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So for a game like that, I would really write into how does the voice sound that's bringing you into the game at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
Thinking about how the game talks to the player is really important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I will spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, this is like a really fun thing, and I feel like you'll dig this.
Okay.
The point of view of the narrator in an RPG is interesting to me.
It is.
You know, because some people write it as this omniscient, encyclopedic entity. It's just telling you what the rules are. But then, of course, you could write it as a character who is in the world, and this book could, in fact, be a book that exists in the world of the game.
Interesting. Oh, man. That's really, really interesting to me, too, because and I think that I can see how it just slightly affects how the feeling of the game can kind of feel. Like in a game I ran a while ago, I remember... instead of games where I've played where it's sort of like, this is the room, this is what you see, this is like how it feels, this is the threats in the room, whatever it is, kind of like you said, encyclopedic knowledge, omniscient. I've also when I do it, I feel a little bit more like I just get really excited by what people are doing, and so I'm like, that's awesome, okay, so you're doing this, and then this comes in and starts doing this, and then like what does that do to you, like how are you feeling right now? And so I think that having like a narrative voice that's just like really excited by what's happening maybe changes the experience for the players, and I had never even thought about that. That's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's not, there's all kinds of different ways, right? It's something that you can play with. And in Business Wizards, one of the things that we did was we wrote the character creation as though you're being interviewed by this HR wizard. You know,
that's just a great sentence. An HR wizard is very, very funny to me.
Exactly. See, finger wands. That's what I always say. But like, I love stuff like that. I love to kind of like, it's that thing where you're kind of like blurring the border. And I think that there's just so many fun ways you can do that. And I take inspiration from traditional fiction in techniques for like blurring the boundaries between, sort of like, I'm me sitting down to read a book, and then like, okay, now the book feels like it's an artifact of the world, and within that artifact there's a story, within that story there's another story, and then you've like disappeared your understanding of exactly what reality is. And you can do that just in like, because concretely speaking, you know, oftentimes with RPGs you sit down and you're like, this is the setting. And thinking about exactly how you write the sentences that convey what the setting is can be a really exciting creative occasion. And, you know, depending on what your world is, you can use these subtle techniques to kind of like have that stuff like draw you into the world, you know?
Yeah, totally. So one of the things that I really also wanted to kind of pick your brain about was, okay, so you have this creative idea. You've started writing stuff down. What is a process that people listening to this, or people that you teach in your classes, what do you suggest that they do to bring their idea to a finished product.
Yes.
Something that they can hold in their hands and share with friends. Is there like tips, tricks, all that kind of stuff?
Yes. This is my super specialty. I love talking about this because like my huge thing, especially when you get into interactive fiction, writing games, and whether that's like, I'm going to make a video game, I'm going to make a module for an RPG, I'm going to write my own RPG, whatever it is. It's hard to finish that.
Yeah.
Because often you'll be like, oh, I have this idea. And then you sit down to do it. And it's like, either what you're doing isn't reflecting the idea, or it's expanding out and out and out and out.
Yeah.
And it's just becoming this like, oh, this is going to take 20 years, right?
Yeah.
So what I tell people to do is, again, constraints lead to creativity. Mm-hmm. So in creative process, you can set a constraint that's either based on how long is this, and say, I'm going to write something that is 10 pages, or I'm going to write a 1-page RPG. It has to fit on a page.
Yeah.
Or you can set a constraint that is time-based and say, I'm giving myself 2 weeks. This has to be done by then.
Yeah.
Obviously, like, you often need other people to enforce those constraints.
For sure, yeah.
So, I mean, I obviously advocate people to, like, either find a creative community that's your friends who are like, okay, this is due. We want to read it and play it. Or game jams are a great way. And then one of the things that I work on and publish in with Ninth Level Games is a level 1 anthology.
Yeah.
And if you're an indie RPG writer and you're excited about trying to write something and have other people play it who aren't your game group, level 1 is a really great creative constraint to inspire people to finish things.
Yeah.
It's all only short RPGs. The max word count is 1,500 words, which is just a few pages.
Yeah.
And if you thought about like, oh, at some point, maybe I'll try to get this in an anthology, it can only be 1,500 words. Then you can say, okay, like 1,500 words means I can do the setting, I can do my core mechanics, maybe do a character sheet or an example scenario, and then I've filled the pages, and that's what the game is for now.
Yeah.
That's
so interesting. I had Mike Sands, who developed Monster of the Week, on a couple months ago at this point, and he was talking about a game that he was developing, and he said that it was, like you said, it was ballooning out, and he said as an exercise to really get him focused on the feeling of the game and the mechanics, he said, okay, I need to write what I have in 1 page. So exactly like you said, like a 1-pager. And he actually sent me the 1 page, and it's really interesting what he included and like what he decided to put in. So yeah, I think that's like a really brilliant idea of giving yourself creative limits, and also accountability is always important.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard. I know a couple of folks in even my friend circle who are trying to develop stuff, and it's a slog.
Yeah. The other thing I will say about that's such a great idea what he did of like just sit down and do the 1-pager as an exercise. The thing that reminded me of that I also talk to people about a lot is like, if you make like a tiny version of it that's complete, then what you can do is kind of go like this. I'm demonstrating it, but I'll verbally say what I'm doing, which
Nat
is like...
has their hands together and is slowly moving them apart.
My hands are moving apart, like, together. So it's like, instead of, if you imagine, like, you're starting at the base and you're adding layers like a foundation until you get to the top.
Yeah.
It's like you have this little thing, maybe like a sandwich, with 2 pieces of bread and 1 piece of meat in the middle.
Yeah.
And then now that you have the complete sandwich, we can put lettuce, tomatoes, other meat, pickles, sauerkraut, whatever you want to put in there.
The flavors.
Exactly. But the idea is like, once you have that complete sandwich, it's like, okay, a version of this exists. And now I'm going to use the time I have and the interest I have, because interest in a project is not infinite, to put flavors and more meat and whatever would make this a delicious sandwich before I move on and want to eat something else.
So you just said something that really struck a chord deep inside of me. As somebody who has done a lot of writing projects, I'm a playwright. I do improv comedy. I'm writing stuff all the time. And you just said interest in a project is not infinite, and I've never related to something so deeply in my life. So can you talk a little bit more about that and like management systems and how to like make sure that you use that resource effectively?
Yes. Oh my gosh. No, it's so real. For me, that's just a constant force I battle with. Just, if you're creative in this kind of way, I think you're always chasing the spark. You're chasing the collaborators. You're chasing that like magical feeling where you're just like in the flow of making.
Yeah.
And I think like you can actually, through time and iterating and working on multiple projects, learn how long your attention span is for a particular kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the first way to start doing that is to work on a second project.
Yeah.
So what I often do with folks is I'll be like, okay, if you're going to make a game in my class, don't make a game that's set in your world building thing that you've been doing since you were 16.
Yeah.
And people are like, no, like
my precious world.
My world. I'm like, you have to make up something from scratch right now. Yeah. And I'm horrible because like people, I'm like Coach Nat, like I'll say like make a crossover IP like Business Wizards. I'm like, this is a really fun one I do. I'm like, take a public domain short story and a genre conceit, mash them up. That's what you're working on. You make that for the next 4 weeks. And people are just like, what? Like, but, if you're someone like you who is actually like in a kind of active creative practice and you work on all these things, what I have learned to do, and this is insight hard earned over many years of struggling with this, is I've learned that I have a particular narrative arc that's my internal rail of my own story of my relationship with a project. Mm-hmm. And I can kind of feel out where I am on that arc, right? Yeah. So I think, commonly I would say that for an average project, 8 months is like the length of that arc for me.
Yeah.
And what happens is like thinking about stories, right? You have this initial sense of stakes, tension, need, desire, right? And then you're working toward getting that desire fulfilled by the completion of the project.
Yes.
And then either that desire is fulfilled or you realize like the peak of the mountain is so far away that desire will like never be fulfilled. And then you're like, oh, I have this other desire that seems more doable. Yeah. And so what I do is I think about like, if that's like an 8-month span, what is the version of the project that I could actually reach before I get to the end of this arc or jump off of it and go somewhere else?
That's really a smart thing to do because I think a lot of us, especially like I'm very guilty of this. We see the media that we see around us that has, millions of dollars put behind it or just like creative teams put behind it. It looks so polished and it looks so good and it's so big in scale. And so when we start a project, we try to grab everything our arms can wrap around. And then, like you said, it's sort of like at least in my experience, we see that the mountain is very far away.
Yeah.
And that's tough. So like I remember during the pandemic when I was writing my first play, I had a friend who would consistently, every Saturday, we would check in and just like be sending each other pages. And that practice of like connecting with a friend, like emotionally, creatively, actually became more important of a desire than actually seeing the play done.
Yeah.
So that's like how I kind of skirted the the attention deficit thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally think that is something we should all be aware of. Any creators that are listening to this, just, know yourself, don't punish yourself for, eventually getting bored of a project. It happens literally to every single person.
I know. And also congrats on writing your first play during the pandemic. Like, that's really exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. It is somewhere where I haven't looked at it in a while because I literally was working on it for like a full year. And then I was like, I can't look at this for a long time. But it needs a couple of drafts to be ripped through before it's like, producible probably. But yeah, it was a huge sense of accomplishment. And that's another thing everyone should, you are going to have something you can hold in your hands at the end, and ultimately that is really, really satisfying. So keep at it for folks who are working on stuff.
Yes, 100%.
Nat, this has been a fantastic conversation. Before we end, though, I have two sort of main questions. One is, where do you see the RPG, TTRPG writing space heading? I know we have like a lot of shakeups happening within bigger companies where more diverse voices are coming in, and we have like a lot of new, we were talking about that narrative structure that is so inherent to the Western canon. We're starting to see that being shaken up a little bit with the rise of like South Korean films and a lot of things like that are starting to kind of come into the Western sphere and kind of shake up storytelling. So in interactive fiction writing or just story writing in general, where do you kind of see stuff going in the next 5-10 years kind of thing?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it harkens back to this moment I had. I was at this party for this huge creative writing conference called AWP. It's the creative writing conference.
Yeah.
And I was at this party with this, talking to this absolutely wonderful woman who was just about to publish her debut novel. And she was talking to me about games.
Yeah.
And she was very much of the creative writing world and was saying, oh, I love games. Like, I know some people who worked on some title that's like a big name title. I think it might have been Exploding Kittens.
Nice.
But she was saying, like, I really liked it, but I feel like there just needs to be more. It was like, I just wish that there was more games for like women and like, like
yeah, for sure,
queer people and people of color who like really love games, but like maybe we don't want to play like in a zero-sum way, or like we want to tell like stories that like we're a part of or something. Like it was kind of like, she was like, it would at some point maybe there will be some games out there that like exist to do this. And I was like, because like obviously I was like, oh my gosh, like this woman is my audience. But there's like this gap between like people out there in the arts who are increasingly becoming aware of this area of creativity.
Yeah.
And then like the people, the folks who are doing some of that like shaking up, kind of existing in this like bubble.
Yeah.
And I think where I would like to see the industry go is that bubble isn't walled in itself.
Yeah.
And it's still, I mean, it's obviously like, I'm like both optimistic because of the brilliance of the creators and friends that I work with, and also like frustrated because being in that bubble, and like, it's very clear to me, like when you're in a con environment, like how that dynamic functions.
Yeah, for sure.
And like, one thing I will say is like, you play the games that you want to play, and there's no obligation for people to play any particular kind of game. And I think that's the amazing thing about playing role-playing games, is like, it is this sandbox. But I think where I'm hoping it will go is that the cultural capital that the folks in this bubble have gradually becomes the capital that could support publishing entities, kind of a greater like material influence. Because at the end of the day, like this industry is a capitalist industry where we're driving in a particular nerd economy.
Yeah.
And I'd like to, and I know that there's some people working right now who are kind of coming into positions of influence, just with the changeover of folks who are leading up games on Kickstarter. An amazing collaborator who's one of the most generous people ever and who really helped me get started in the games world, Nicole Amato, is now working with Kickstarter. And just knowing that there's folks like that coming into these major roles of like helping projects see the light of day is feeling really positive to me. So I don't know. Part of me is like, it's never going to change. But another part of me is like, I think 5 years from now, what I'm hoping is that there's some bigger entities that are kind of more arrived and established that can put some real like power behind some of the games that you and I are like geeking out about now of like, it's so cool that this functions this way and this has all these possibilities.
Yeah, totally. I very much agree with that. I think that our marketing economy only has so much attention. We're in a space where people are already pulled 100 different ways, and our sort of niche here with interactive fiction and games and everything is already fairly strong and honestly pretty strung out when it comes to attention. Everyone is, there's just so much weird stuff happening all the time, and just playing a game can completely absorb your attention, and you can kind of lose track of everything else that's happening in the space. So I totally feel just like more people entering into those kind of movers and shakers that direct attention is going to be huge. I think something that I was thinking about when you were talking about that woman who was talking about games that kind of appeal to other people. I had a really long conversation once, and a little bit of it is captured on one of our episodes with a writer friend of mine who was talking about how a lot of RPG games right now are centered around violence as a narrative tool.
Yeah.
And how violence is really the expected way things are resolved. And I think that just that in itself is a holdover from a generation where there was only one sort of cultural viewpoint on how things should be done. And I like, for me, I'm just really excited to see a lot more systems that have like a huge breadth in how you tell your stories, instead of, okay, now you have to go kill the bad guy.
I mean, one thing that I've seen in the Twitter discourse is like this sense that, and I think rightfully so, some of the old guard will say these newer designers are reinventing and resolving the same design problems that people have been working with since the 70s. And that's frustrating to see, because it's like, yes, we've already talked about this. But then the flip side to that is, because role-playing games are rooted in war games, the reinvention and resolving of the same design problems, but from a perspective that's not situated in war games, will inevitably result in some interesting creativity that can sit beside that kind of tactical, combat-driven stuff that, you know, is kind of the roots of the hobby.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's so it's very pernicious because it's so baked into almost every piece of media or game that we play that we don't usually even notice that that's what it is.
I know.
And you see like a lot of with actual plays of people taking TTRPGs and then playing them for narrative stories that are then released as, you know, pieces of media. There's like a conversation that's happening where people are like, yeah, but they're not following the rules. And it's like, yeah, but everyone is there telling a story. And it seems like everyone really likes that part of it.
Exactly.
So I do have some hope that there's going to be some really interesting innovations within the space when it comes to how to tell stories soon, especially with all the new perspectives coming in. I'm really excited about it. I'm glad to hear that you also agree that there's a lot of change that is happening and will happen in the future. Now, I did disagree with you pretty heavily on one thing. You said that there was one game, like there's no game that like we have to play, and I would say Business Wizards is an exception to that rule. But I would love to hear a little bit more about what you're working on, what you have out there. How can people interact with you and your work?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So I work with and write for Ninth Level Games. I help them with marketing, editing, a whole kind of slate of the small indie press stuff that we do in the games world. And I came in there as a writer, so a lot of the work I've done in RPGs you can find through Ninth Level Games. Business Wizards, I've published games in the Level 1 anthology, which I talked about earlier. We have a new one coming out in the Awesome World series, which is a cartoon world of whimsy, friendship, magic. And that one is going to be called Horseshoe Academy.
Okay.
So Horseshoe Academy is like magical horses at boarding school.
Very good. I love it.
All that stuff you can shop at ninthlevel.com. Sorry, let me say that again. Ninthlevel.com is where you can find the RPGs I write with them. I also recently kickstarted my own project in Zine Quest 4. It was my first indie project not done affiliated with Ninth Level in the RPG space.
Cool.
That zine is called Ball of the Wild. And
All right.
the conceit there is you play as animals who dress up as other animals.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love that.
So they're putting on a performance for Mother Nature in these
Yeah.
incredible animal costumes. I just finished out the Kickstarter for that. Of course, we did fund and hit a couple stretch goals,
Nice.
which was
Exciting.
such a delight. I'm thinking of offering pre-orders on my personal website, so folks who missed the Kickstarter should still be able to get a piece of it. My personal website is nataliemesnard.com. That's NATALIEMESNARD.com.
Also, all of these links are also going to be in the show notes if people want to hear that or just click a button to get to these places. And check Tabletop's Twitter feed at Tabletop. We're also going to be releasing some of this stuff out there so people can find it more easily if you're letter impaired.
Exactly. Yeah, and then the final thing I'll say, if folks are interested in taking a class with me, I do teach writing tabletop role-playing games, interactive fiction, and world building at a site called Catapult. Catapult is a creative writing platform where you can take courses in poetry, nonfiction, fiction, all the traditional stuff, and then I've got all your interactive stuff covered. So it's such a fun community. It's a great way to get that creative accountability and structuring.
Yeah.
So folks can check that out. Catapult does CO, and we can probably list that in the show notes as well if you want to take a class.
And I, just from this conversation, know that I think many people should. This has been a great conversation, Nat. Thank you so much for talking to us. Everyone, take a look in the show notes. Find some of those things you're interested. I highly recommend Business Wizards. It's a hilarious, fun game to play with your friends. Like Nat said, it's a one-off, so you can play just in an evening. Thank you so much for coming on Tabletop, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, see ya.
Bye.
Bye.